The objective of this lesson is to learn about file input and output in Python. Before you can read or write into a file, you have to prepare the file and tell Python what do you intend to do with the file. For example, you have to tell Python what format the file has, and do you intend to read from it, or do you intend to write into it, or do you intend to append to the end of it, and so on. So preparing a file is done by using a function called open. The format of this function is simple. All you have to do is say open and then give the file name, and there are two optional parameters that you can use. One of them is called mode, which tells Python if you want to read or write into a file, and the other one is buffering, which determines what kind of buffering will be used. And then you assign the output of the open function to a object, which is a variable that you select, and it can have any name that you want. And then from that point on, every time you want to read or write from this file, you refer to that object. Here's an example. I'm preparing a file for read. I'm using the open function. The name of the file is test.txt, and the symbol R after the name of file indicates that I would like to read from this file. And then the return value from the open function will be assigned to a variable. In this case, I called it my file. And then from now on, every time I want to use that file, I refer to this variable. How do I read from a file? Once the file is open, you can read from a file by using the read method. Here is an example. In the first line, I am opening a file. The name of a file is test.txt, and I'm preparing it for read. In the second line, I am reading from the file and reading from the entire file actually, and I'm assigning the result to a variable called myString. So in that case, the variable would include the entire file. And then I go through my program and do the rest of my code, whatever I want to do with the content of the file. And you have to remember that at the end, you have to close the file. There are other methods to read from a file. For example, you can read one line at a time, or you can read all the lines in a file. There are three different ways you can read from a file. You have seen the first method, which is a simple read, which reads the entire file. The second method is to use a function called readLine. In this case, every time you call this function, it reads one line from the file and returns a string to you. You can also read all the lines from a file by using a method called readLines. Remember that this method returns a list to you, and each element of the list would be one line of the file. So how do you write into a file? To write to a file, you use the write method. Here is an example. In the first line, I'm opening a file. The name of the file is test.txt, and I'm preparing it for write. In the second line, I am using the write method to write a string hello to the file. And of course, the rest of the program, I do whatever I like to do. And again, I have to remember to close the file at the end of my program. Let me show you the Python code to read a file. Before, of course, I can read a file, I have to create the file or have a file to be read from. And here's my file. I just created a simple text file with 4 lines in it, and I call it test_file.txt, and I want to make sure that I save it somewhere that I can find it later. So I'm going to save this file and close it. Now, in the Python environment, I'm writing my program. The first line of my program is opening the file and then preparing it for read. In the next line of my program, I'm using the read method to read the entire file and assign it to a string called my_str. In the next line, I'm printing that string, and in the last line, I'm closing the file. So now if I run my program, and here is the 4 lines of my file. Now let's modify the program which reads the entire file such that it can read only a single line from a file. All I have to do is everything else is the same, but rather than using the read method, I will use the read line method. And if I run my program this time, you see that it only reads 1 line from the file. Just remember that if I repeat the read line method again, it will read the second line. For example, let me show you here. I'm reading the first line in line number 2, and then in line number 4 I'm reading another line from my program. So if I run this program again, you see that this is the first line from my file, and here is the second line from my file. What if I want to read all the lines? Then in that case, of course, rather than read line, I will say read lines. Remember that if I use read lines instead of read line, it reads all the lines of my file. However, this time, rather than returning a string to me, it would return a list to me. So this time the variable my_str would be a list. So let's run my program and see what happens. First of all, notice that it is a list and not a string. Second, notice that the first element of my list is the first line of my text file, including the carriage return. The second element of my list is the second line of my text file, including the carriage return. The third line of my list is the third line of my text file, including the carriage return. However, the last element of my list is the last line of my file, but it does not include a carriage return because I did not put a carriage return after the last line of my text file. Now let me show you how to write a program to write into a file. You have to use the open statement, except that rather than R here, you have to say W, which indicates that you would like to write into a file. And also remember that if you put a name of a file here, if the file already exists, then you will overwrite it, and if it does not exist, then Python creates a new file for you. So if right now, if I write anything into this file, whatever was in there, it will be destroyed. So let me call it a different name. Let me call it _2. So I'm preparing a file for writing. Again, remember, right now this file does not exist. Then in here, rather than reading from the file, I will say my file, then use the write method, and then I write anything that I want in it. For example, I would say hello there, and that's it. I have to close my file. And if I run this program, of course, I do not generate anything on the screen because I wrote into the file. However, if I try to open the file now, you see that there is a file called test_file_2.txt, and the content of it is hello there. And that is how you write into a file. So what did you learn in this lesson? You learned how to open a file in Python. You learned how to read from a file in Python. you learn how to write into a file, and you learn that you should close the file before exiting from your program.